Good afternoon. The Ad Hoc Committee on Gang Violence and Youth Development will now come to order. We'll begin with item number 1. Hold on 1 second. And item number 3, we still have some information that's forthcoming, so we will put item number 3 over to the next committee hearing of this committee. So item number 3, we will put that item over, and we'll begin with item number 1. Thank you.
Item number 1 is a discussion relative to the Youth Prison Reduction through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Support, and Education Act, or the Youth Promise Act, H.R. 1064.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to report some of the activities surrounding the Youth Promise Act, which is legislation by Congressman Bobby Scott. As of today, the Youth Promise Act, which is otherwise known as H.R. 1064, introduced in the House of Representatives by Congressman Bobby Scott and Mike Castle, and in the United States Senate by Senators Bob Casey from Pennsylvania and Olympia Snowe, another U.S. Senator, has 109 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives and 7 co-sponsors in the Senate. On February 19th, I held a public hearing for the Youth Promise Act with Congressman Bobby Scott. We hosted him here in Los Angeles, and over 60 community-based organizations co-sponsored the hearing, with over 300 people attending the hearing and overwhelmingly stating their support for this critically needed youth development legislation that would substantially increase funding for prevention and intervention services. As a direct result of the hearing and support of the community, the City of Los Angeles was the first city in the country to pass, with unanimous support, a resolution in support of the Youth Promise Act. Since then, the cities of Pasadena, California, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Santa Fe, Hampton, Norfolk, Newport News, Richmond have also passed resolutions in favor of the Youth Promise Act, with a growing number of elected leaders and nationally recognized agencies such as the National Association of Counties, Boy Scouts of America, Juvenile Court Judges of California, and hundreds of more organizations supporting the bill. I personally testified in front of Congress 2 weeks ago at a National Day of Advocacy in support of the Youth Promise Act, and can tell you that there is momentum in Washington to truly invest in the youth development and provides resources for those youth in communities who need it the most. At the time of that hearing, for example, they had just crossed 80 congressional members that have signed on the bill. And as I just mentioned, over 109 co-sponsors from the House of Representatives have signed on to this day. Today is an opportunity to get an update on this historic legislation and to hear from advocates, public defenders, scholars, and community members on the status of the bill and what we, as people interested in public safety and increasing opportunities for our youth and communities, could do to help pass the Youth Promise Act. At this moment in time, I'd like to ask someone from the Youth Justice Coalition to come forward. And is there anybody here who attended the hearing in Washington? Please come forward. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Councilman.
Good afternoon.
First, I'm very honored to be here. I think everyone knows that there's no body but this committee that has worked harder to pass the Youth Promise Act, and we're all very proud of the fact that LA was the first city to pass a resolution in support of it. So I really want to thank everything that this City Council, but especially this committee, did to lead that effort. I think that you mentioned the National Day of Action that happened on May 7th, but LA once again really took the lead on that. I know from the Youth Justice Coalition, 364 calls were made by young people to congressmen, and that over 600 calls were made from LA County and LA area. So I think we led again the nation in terms of making an effort from LA to pass it. Before that National Day of Action, there were 80.
Hold on a second. This building's on rollers, it's my understanding, so it might feel a little bit more rocky than it really is.
Man, we're not afraid of earthquakes.
I know. You can tell who's not from Los Angeles. You can see the look on their face. Okay, go ahead.
Before the National Day of Action, there were 83 congressional co-sponsors of the bill, and now there's 109. And I think it's it's gaining more momentum than most other bills, not only this year, but in past years. It certainly has a lot more momentum, we're really glad to say, than the Schiff-Feinstein efforts in either the Senate or the House to build up more lockups for young people. And it's the first federal bill in recent memory that anyone doing the work now remembers anyway, that really promotes youth jobs, youth centers, youth progress over youth incarceration.
On that note, I think that I should also thank you for bringing that up, because as far as I know, according to Congressman Bobby Scott and the many congressional members that I've spoken to when I was in Washington, this is the first time they've seen a bill in recent memory that actually addresses juvenile justice programming. Like you mentioned, jobs, resources, programs for our young people. It's the first time that there's a bill that does not attempt to undermine that by cloaking the bill as a suppression bill. For example, it's my understanding that the U.S. Senator from California, Dianne Feinstein, and also a congressional member have a bill that they are labeling as a juvenile justice bill, but in reality, those bills aren't juvenile justice bills. They are, by and large, simply put, suppression-oriented bills with enhancement they're enhancement legislation, meaning that when someone commits a crime, if they're called a gang member or for some reason identified as a gang member, they're looking at enhancements for the same crime that would occur on the other side of town. That's one example of what those bills are like. So this bill by Congressman Bobby Scott, the Youth Promise Act, is truly a juvenile justice bill in the pure sense. And it's something this country has not seen in many, many years. And I think it's really important for everybody to understand there's a reason why in this country we have two justice systems. We have a system for the adults and we have the system for the youth. And the reason why we do so is because it is unequivocal, and more psychological science is showing that youth do not have the same mental capacity as adults, and therefore rehabilitation and having an opportunity to rehabilitate is unequivocally necessary for us to move forward and to reduce crime in this country. And unfortunately, there have been way too many bills, both at the state legislative levels around the country and also at the federal level, that have called themselves juvenile justice legislation, when in reality they're not. All they are is enhancement bills when it comes to affording law enforcement more tools and more opportunities to just, after the fact, after the crime has occurred, to then try to address the issue by just giving longer sentences and punishing the young people instead of having an opportunity to find out where they're at and to figure out how to prevent crime. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on the Feinstein and Schiff bill, but I would say that one of the most alarming things about that effort is that it will take juvenile life without parole national. And now the United Nations has really led an effort internationally so that we're now the only country in the world that has that sentence remaining for youth. And 250 youth are serving that sentence currently in California, 2,503 nationally. And both Feinstein and Schiff's bill will increase the use of juvenile.
Another thing that is very surprising on that point is that a lot of Americans think that if a young person is going to be tried and or convicted with life without parole, they're assuming that they're being convicted or tried under a count of first-degree murder. And that's not the case. No. And that's one of the issues that this country should have and individuals should have with the laws that have been passed in recent history. You have young people that are actually being tried and in some cases convicted, where they throw the book at them and they have a sentence of life without parole, and that individual, surprisingly, did not even carry a weapon when it came to the crime that they were being tried for. No. And most Americans would think if someone is going to be tried for life without parole, they either carried a gun, for example, they shot somebody with a gun, they killed somebody with a gun, they tried to kill somebody with a gun or a weapon. And in many cases, there are around the country, as of today, many cases where young people have been tried to be convicted with life without parole or convicted with life without parole, and they did not even handle a weapon in the process of a crime.
Yeah. Two other, just again, real briefly, but in addition, 56% of the young people that are serving that sentence in California that had adult co-defendants are serving more time than their adult co-defendants, even though in all those cases the adult co-defendants were the ones that really thought up the crime. So there's a lot of inequities in it.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I think most Americans would be surprised about, and it's up to us to enlighten the average American, the average voter in this country, to realize that how is it, logically, that you have a crime committed where there's an adult and there's a youth, and the youth is serving more time than the adult? How is that? And once again, I think that's a disconnect between what the average American thinks, the public thinks, about what is going on with our judicial system versus what is really going on in our judicial system, especially when it comes to juveniles. Juveniles that are supposed to have a separate court, they're supposed to have more of an opportunity for them to be remanded to something where they're going to be rehabilitated. And once again, if you're serving a life sentence, what's the purpose for rehabilitation if that person's never going to reenter society?
Right, exactly. The last things I would like to say in support of the Youth Promise Act, but also give caution to Los Angeles, is that I believe that the Youth Promise Act will pass. I believe it will transform communities across the country, and I believe it will inspire people in LA to change our policies. But I think it's going to take the same steadfast leadership on the part of this committee, as well as a similar committee that needs to be built and similar leadership that needs to be built at the county level if the Youth Promise Act will really deliver on its promise locally. And I say this not to discourage people from supporting the Youth Promise Act. There's a meeting this Thursday at 10 a.m. at the Youth Justice Coalition, but it's not sponsored by us. It's sponsored by many groups and the City Council. It's at 1137 East Redondo Boulevard, right on the corner of Redondo and West Boulevard, about one light west of Florence and Crenshaw. And it's open to everyone, elected officials, law enforcement, community members that are interested in trying to pass this bill. For us in LA, I think the work for us will be to answer the families, for example, the families last night who gathered in Inglewood because yet another young man, the father of three, who was unarmed, was killed by the police there. Police shootings across the county, not just in Inglewood, are up 25% of unarmed people. Today's vote in the City Council to cut the budgets of every single department with the exception of police, I think is another cautionary note. We have a 48% decrease in juvenile crime in this nation, and our juvenile crime rates locally are at their lowest levels since 1967. But still, locally, all we are investing in is the lockup of young people. We know there's been some increases in local support for gang intervention and prevention, but they've been much less than what this committee has wanted to see happen. So I would encourage us as we move forward to pass the Youth Promise Act nationally, that we also push hard for the creation of a youth development department here in the county, that both is a city-county effort, not only from LA, but from all the other local cities, so that when that money does come down, it doesn't cycle through probation as other public monies have, because in other counties, what become youth development efforts are here youth lockup efforts. Similarly, I think that we would want to have a real request that the city look critically at a budget that only promotes law enforcement as the main part of that budget. And we've said this a lot, but just a 1% set aside from law enforcement, courts, city attorney, and district attorney in the county of Los Angeles give us $100 million to jumpstart that youth development department and to match what comes down from the Youth Promise Act to have our promises locally carry a lot more weight. And finally, I think there's a lot of departments in this budget crisis that are easily done away with or made so small or so insignificant that they lose their power. And so I would really encourage us to look out for departments like the City and County Human Relations Commissions, which have built the Watts Gang Task Force, which have built and supported a lot of the efforts around youth gang intervention in the city and county, and where the efforts to pass the Youth Promise Act really wouldn't carry much weight in terms of the local youth organizing and community organizing that needs to happen to make that vision a reality, unless we have an independent Human Relations Commission at the city and county level. So I really want to thank you again for not only today's opportunity, but all the opportunities we've had to bring these issues to this committee, and for the fact that this committee regularly really listens to the voices of young people and community members.
Well, thank you. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that this committee is not here to dictate. This committee certainly has, since I've been the chairman, been involved in making sure that we listen and that we understand what the practitioners have to offer. in our communities. Because the fact of the matter is, even though we have a police department that is now rounding off to about 10,000 members, we still only have gang interventionists throughout this city of 4 million people that round off at about 60, maybe 70, 80 tops. And the fact of the matter is that is a lopsided system. And even the chief of police that has about 10,000 bodies to work with within his department, that's just sworn officers, much less civilians on top of that. He actually agrees and admits that we need to make sure that we do have prevention and intervention programs. And he's admitted many, many times, and so have his assistant chiefs as well throughout the city, have admitted that without intervention and prevention programs, without the other opportunities fortified in the communities, they cannot and will not be able to reduce crime. They will not be able to improve the quality of life of Angelinos without these other efforts going on. So when we only afford ourselves an opportunity to fund intervention and prevention programs in the city of Los Angeles at a combined amount bouncing around $50 million, and we have a police department that is actually utilizing well over $1.3 billion a year, that is an imbalanced system. I'm not saying anything against the actual police department. What I'm saying is that just goes to show what the imbalance is here locally within this city, and that translates in the county of Los Angeles and almost every city in California and throughout the country. We need to find a better balance, because the fact of the matter is when an officer has to draw their weapon, 99.9% of the time it's after a crime has been committed. And when you get into intervention and prevention, you're talking about preventing those incidents, preventing victims from occurring, preventing crime from occurring, and getting people out of a life of crime and into a productive life. And another thing that's very important that I think people need to understand is to incarcerate a youth in the state of California, the state reports that it's $252,000 a year per youth of state tax dollars that are spent to incarcerate a youth in California. And when it comes to local programs, like some of the programs of intervention and prevention that we have here locally, they're as low as $1,200 to $1,300 per youth. So when you look at the magnitude difference of the amount of money it takes to harness a young person and work toward getting them on the right direction at a cost of $1,200 to $1,300, that is where we should be investing more of our dollars. Mm-hmm. And just by preventing the incarceration of one youth, we could assist dozens and dozens and dozens of young people just with the savings of that one youth that we did not have to incarcerate. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Councilman, for allowing me to express my support for the Youth Promise Act. My name is Jessica, and I'm an arts educator from Cypress Park. I work with an international cultural organization called Capoeira Brazil and a nonprofit called Alma Vida. And this summer I'll also be working with the Gang Reduction Youth Development Office.
What's Alma Vida mean?
Alma Vida, Adolescents Learning Movement Arts.
Okay. But a direct translation, what's Alma mean?
Alma is soul in Portuguese and Spanish.
And Vida?
Life. So this summer I'll also be working with the Gang Reduction Youth Development Office as a site coordinator, either in Glassell Park or in Cypress Park, so just right in my neighborhood. I really feel strongly by exposing youth to the arts, it is remarkable the impact you can have on their lives. In the case of our organization, the art of capoeira transforms movement into nonverbal communication, conflict resolution, and creative expression, and provides at-risk youth with an ethnically and culturally diverse community of mentors. All those things we speak of in a qualitative sense, developing self-confidence, healthy living habits, providing creative outlets, preventing and intervening in at-risk behavior, can also become reality through exposure to arts and other support, education, and prevention programs. This is why our organizations support and advocate for the Youth Promise Act. It is a forward-looking, common-sense solution to a vicious cycle. It creates coordinating councils that will ensure community-specific programs that are evidence-based and promising. And as Congressman Scott stresses, it's not only morally responsible, it is fiscally responsible. $65 billion to incarcerate is far too much. Myself and my husband, who also is an arts educator, had the opportunity to go to the Youth Promise Act Advocacy Day in Washington, D.C., and we were especially moved to action and inspired by your impassioned and sincere comments. Thank you and your staff for leading the charge here in LA and nationwide. Directly following the Thursday morning rally, as you know, advocates canvassed Capitol Hill and visited representatives. It was a successful drive, but our goal to get our goal is to get 435 members of Congress to sign on. It's not a, I think it can be accomplished. As you said, I believe the Youth Promise Act will pass. As a juvenile justice advocate, as an arts educator, and as a resident of Northeast LA, I cannot stress the necessity of the YPA enough. Los Angeles is the front line in this ideological battle. We need to take the tired dogma, the ineffective policies, and the bureaucratic insensitivity to the needs of our youth and transform it. There are many organizations that do amazing work with at-risk youth and with juvenile offenders. These organizations need to be funded in order for their work to continue and really to grow. That's really important, to grow, not to be downsized. These effective programs and real solutions will be supported through YPA grants. As a city, as a diverse community of parents, teachers, law enforcement officials, artists, faith-based and youth development organizations, and elected officials, we need to abandon the focus on incarceration and understand the value of our youth. The value of prison reduction through opportunities, mentoring, intervention, support, and education. The Youth Promise Act is not a wistful piece of legislation. It is a practical piece of legislation. We must continue writing, emailing, and calling our representatives and senators. We need 100% participation. This is all of our responsibility, and the work has really just begun. LA needs to lead the fight in getting the YPA passed, and I really believe our future depends on it.
You mentioned getting away from incarceration. One thing I'd like to clarify, because let me use a term that some people in their ignorance use as a simplistic way of, in my opinion, being defensive and attacking legislation like the Youth Promise Act. They use sound bites like, oh, is this another bill that's just another hug a thug? What does it mean when somebody says hug a thug? You do an arts program, right? Is your program surrounded around hugging people or empowering people? What is it that you do with your arts program? Because I've never understood that hug a thug term.
Well, what we do is we provide a community that removes youth from the need to have a gang involvement. We create I guess you could say, a positive gang, a community that supports them through help with tutoring, mentoring, training, and they really see that once they become part of this community of people from all different races, training something that is different but came from struggle. Capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art that comes from struggle. They see a lot of, they understand it, they feel themselves through it, and they no longer have the need to involve themselves in that support, that negative support system of the gangs. So we don't hug a thug. We're actually very, very, very hard on our youth in the sense that we teach discipline and respect. If you cannot respect the system and the art and the tradition, then you don't belong here. But it's very rare that we've worked with very, very tough kids. Actually, we have instructors now that were gang members that have records. Now they've transformed their lives and are instructors 10 years later. So, and this we've done here in LA, but also in Brazil, because our organization comes from Brazil. So.
Okay, so it's not a hug a thug program.
And I don't want to say we shouldn't incarcerate. I believe in a smart on crime, not a tough on crime approach. Right? We need to be smart with our youth, not just to suppress our way into the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Which we're already there,
yeah.
By far. By far the highest incarceration rate in the world when it comes to juveniles and adults, when it comes to per capita basis, and also when it comes to communities of color, we're off the charts. In some communities, it's as many as 4,000, like in some black communities around the country, there's as many as 4,000 people incarcerated per 100,000 constituents. And apparently there's a point of diminishing returns that some studies have shown that you get beyond 500 to 600 adults incarcerated or human beings incarcerated per 100,000, you're going backwards. If you think you're having a positive effect, you're not. It has a negative effect on society, has a negative effect on public safety, et cetera. And in the United States of America, we're far beyond that in many communities, far beyond 500-600 per 100,000. the programs that you're involved in, you guys just sit around and hug each other? A bunch of people say, "I'm a thug, hug me." I mean, what kind of programs are you familiar with?
Well, I want to answer
Yeah.
that two ways. One is that all of us at the Youth Justice Coalition, with the exception of a couple of our teachers, came through the juvenile system. And that means we all have experience with arrest, incarceration, some probation, parole. Many of us have family members that have also been incarcerated. And I can tell you that the one thing that every single young person that went through the system and the one thing that every single young person who entered gangs was looking for was a hug. So when people try to scare us away from legislation because they somehow assume that hugging people is the wrong way to go, I would say that everyone incarcerated will tell you that the first thing they don't have that they need is human interaction, starting with human touch. And that what makes people come out of lockup, even after a few hours, let alone years and years, is solitary confinement and the lack of any kind of sensory connection to the rest of the human people and humankind. So if you want people to come home healthy, that hug is really the first and foremost base to me of all youth development. And if we're afraid of saying that we're not going to hug young people, then to me we've lost the whole point of youth development. And it doesn't matter to me if you're a law enforcement officer trying to do youth development, you're a parole officer, a probation officer trying to do that work, you're a teacher trying to do that work, or you're a youth worker or a gang intervention worker on the streets. The best in all those professions, I've seen them hug many young people, including hugging many young people who the rest of the system would see as quote-unquote thugs, although I think the use of that kind of terminology is really damaging. So I don't think we should be afraid of that at all. But secondly, I'll just speak real briefly about the Youth Justice Coalition, but I think is more important is all the groups that are doing this work around the county and around the nation, because we're really babies in the work. We created a school because so many of our members couldn't even get back into regular schools. Coming home from lockup, oftentimes illegally, you're barred from even entering districts, let alone individual schools. You'd think that coming home from lockup, you'd have a passport immediately to start school the very next day, but young people would flounder at home for weeks and even months without school, even though they were on probation and parole. A probation and parole officer would oftentimes say to them, "Get in school or I'm going to violate you," not "Here's a list of schools that you're already accepted into, just enter in the door."
Or perhaps escorting that young person, telling the school that he belongs here. You need to
Even
admit this young person, right?
Right, exactly.
That really should be what that person's supposed to do. Is everybody aware that when a minor gets a probation officer, that probation officer has custody of that person? That even if that child has parents, even if the child is living back at home with their parents, it is the probation officer that has custody? Again, most Americans don't understand that. They don't realize it. And I'm embarrassed to say that I've been working on this issue for 10 years, and that fact just hit me last year. I didn't even realize it, that the courts, when they give some of these young people a probation officer, that probation officer actually has custody of that person. That probation officer has more authority over that human being than the parents, even when the parents are alive and the child is living with them. It's the probation officer that has custody of that person.
Custody, yes, but not responsibility. So it's still the parents' responsibility to educate them, to feed them, to clothe them, to house them, and oftentimes they're billed for the time that they spend in probation, that's a whole other issue. But I think the hypocrisies, again, of a system that says that we're only going to be tough with young people instead of, as you're saying, smart with young people. So out of necessity, we created our own school. Out of necessity, we have young people there from all different kinds of neighborhoods, rival neighborhoods. Many of them come into the school as enemies. So we rely regularly on not only ourselves, but more importantly, on the gang intervention workers that are working through the city and the county, that we can call on regularly to come in and solve young people's conflicts, solve the conflicts that our young people have with their surrounding neighborhood. We have 4 or 5 neighborhoods right surrounding the school within that 2, 3, 4 block distance from the school. So that's a regular part of the work that we do. And I would say those kind of programs, and again, we're babies in the work. So if you look at a Homeboy Industries, a national and now an international model, it's surprising to me that we don't have a Homeboy Industries throughout the entire county. It's proven again and again and again how successful it is. And yet it's very difficult for homeboys to sustain themselves as one site, let alone in most other counties what maybe would be 10 or 15 sites. Communities and schools, much longer track record of how amazing their work is. And yet this past year has been their hardest year in terms of getting funding to sustain themselves, and they've cut a lot of their programs, and especially cut all the youth development programs that they said was the most successful, like their boxing program, their recording studio, et cetera. So I think that the Youth Promise Act, again, brings a lot of promises in terms of resources, but it's still going to require the leadership locally for us to choose youth development over youth incarceration. And what I think is most important about the act for LA and for similar constituencies It requires us first to assess what our addiction to incarceration has cost the county and the city, and to look locally at what we spend on those systems, and to think about how we can reallocate dollars so we're not just taking federal dollars and plugging up holes, but we're really rethinking how we treat young people countywide.
Well, that's interesting you should say that. I find that many times legislation, when it gets down to the local level, is misinterpreted and misused. You have legislators federally and at the state level that have written legislation and then come to find that the money was supposed to be going to third-party providers, such as not-for-profits, community-based organizations, and then you find over time that 70, 80, 90% of that money ends up in the hands of salaries for government workers, such as the Schiff Cardenas Act that was written by Tony Cardenas, then an assemblyman in California. Turns out that here in the county of Los Angeles, about 70% of those dollars are actually remaining within the Department of Probation. And very few programs are actually being fortified with those dollars. And it's very disappointing, especially when I sit here as the author of that bill and I see what's going on and total misinterpretation of that legislation and a misuse of funds. And I think that we would have crime that would be down much, much less if they utilized those funds appropriately the way the author of the bill meant it to be utilized.
The Youth Promise Act requires local planning councils, what are called local promise councils. And I really encourage this committee to take the lead in forming that council and in giving staff support to that council, because without that council having real teeth, I think that the Youth Promise Act money will go much the
It'll
same
get diluted, yeah, much like the Schiff Cardenas funds. Yeah, absolutely. And also, I see there should be no problem with an organization if they want to incorporate hugs in what they do. Certainly, I don't know of any organization where all they do is hug all day, but for example, and to those people who are cynical and thinking that would be silly. I mean, I've been to many police academy graduations where what's the first thing that people do? They give each other a hug. And I think that's a human element. But the thing is, they don't call those officers thugs. They call them police officers. They give them labels that are more human-like. And one of the reasons why I don't like the word thug, I don't like the words gang members, is because I think to me it's a subliminal way in which society tries to make those people as less than. When you look at all wars or what have you, I don't want to mention any of the names, even the wars that this country have been involved in, all of a sudden the people that they're shooting at, they don't call them human beings. They don't call them by even the origin of their country. They just call them by a derogatory term, which tends to be something to dehumanize them. And that's one of the problems that I think that we have in this country is our young people, especially young people of color in very poor communities, in some ways have been dehumanized. And that's one of the problems that I have when people say gang member. And unfortunately, those terms have made their way into legislation, where you actually have children who aren't even involved with a weapon in the process of a crime, and all of a sudden they're being tried to be put away for life at the age of 14, 15 years old.
I totally agree with you. I'm sorry. I think that looking at language would be one of the first things we would have to do to transform the county. Just the simple language that we use every day in terms of ex-offender, those of us who have records will carry that label with us for life unless we stop using that language in our everyday conversations. And I think one of the ways that translates then into inequities that's more important than just language is in terms of what you were saying around the spending of law enforcement versus the spending of gang intervention. It's not just that the overall budgets are smaller, it's also that the value of the human beings doing the work is so much less. So a gang intervention worker who might have 3 or 4 decades on the street, or in some cases less, is getting between 20 and 30,000, at the most 35,000 in the mayor's contracts. They're on call 24/7. They have beepers and they have to be ready to answer those beepers 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They're the first responders at the scene of shootings. They're constantly put their lives in danger. Most of them do not have health insurance or life insurance, although a growing number are starting to get that. And they make, again, between 20 and 30,000. A police officer coming out of the academy with no street-level experience, most of them not even having grown up in the hood, having very little experience with the day-to-day realities that police work is going to take, start at $58,000 a year in our county and in our city with the LAPD. And they get overtime for every single hour over that they spend. They have full benefits, full retirement, as well as a $7 or $8 million a year budget to clean uniforms, which that alone would fund 7 or 8 full-time youth centers. So I think that looking at the inequities that you spoke of earlier, when you look at the language and how people are dehumanized, it goes straight to their treatment as professionals on the street.
I just wanted to add two things, not to belabor the hug-a-thug point, but I strongly believe, I agree with you completely, that in order to teach respect and discipline, you have to give love first. Because if you don't feel love, or if you don't feel secure in a community by your peers, by your elders, there's no way you're going to respect. There's no way. So that's one of the things that we stress, so I agree with you. And second, somehow our society has branded the most vulnerable elements as gang members and use derogatory terms. I agree completely. We need to refrain from using that language. These are kids. These are kids that haven't been given the opportunity, and we need to rebrand them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're young human beings, and also it's interesting that you should use the word respect, and yet at the same time, every person who passes an enhancement law, a sentence enhancement law, always talks about people need to respect the law. But you're absolutely right. They need to have some basic understandings and nurturing of respect, self-respect, respect for others, respect for elders, before they're going to respect the law. And with all due respect, most enhancement laws aren't even understood by the community that they're trying to affect. So that deterrent idea is ridiculous. I served as a member of the legislature. I witnessed colleagues talk about how this law of enhancing this for this crime, this sentence for a particular crime, this enhancement, this doubling or tripling of it or what have you, is going to serve as a deterrent, which is ridiculous because most people who violate the law never read the code. They never read the code, so they don't even know that that law exists. They know that there's right and there's wrong, but they don't know that, wow, if I do this, I'm going to get 17 to life, versus if I do this, I might get probation, what have you. That doesn't go through people's minds. What's most important is what should be going in people's minds is, again, getting down to right and wrong, getting down to the fact of the matter is that they have a place to be and a place to go, so they don't even contemplate committing that crime, that they actually have something. For example, when it comes to the arts, it's really important for people to understand that when young people, with all of their energy and they're just like sponges at their younger ages, when they are engaged in positive activity, studies have shown that there is it's highly unlikely that they're going to be involved in derogatory activity. As long as they stay busy, as long as they're around responsible adults, as long as they have things that interest them, as long as they find out that they themselves are interesting, etc. Those are the kinds of things that we need. But when you have a bunch of young people with nothing to do, when you have a bunch of people throughout a community where kids are watching kids and things of that nature, you have a higher likelihood that an incident is going to occur. So we need to invest in the right places. We need to invest in these young people instead of just sitting around waiting for them to commit a crime and then handcuffing them and then throwing them away at a very expensive price to society, to them and society. Any last comments?
I always want to encourage people to understand that the majority of the people in the system, even though we have young people that are doing life sentences and 25, 35, 45 to life sentences, 46% of the people in our juvenile halls are there for probation violations, not new crimes. This is a truancy issue. This is smoking a cigarette sometimes, just that small, drinking alcohol after school, missing a probation appointment. So the majority of young people, even getting caught up in the system, are not what I would encourage anyone to label as criminals, would not encourage anyone to think of as violent, and this is the majority of who's filling up our cells. So even in a city and county where we have to address violence, know that the majority of people getting locked up are not violent and are not criminals.
I also think it's important for people to understand that when the Youth Promise Act passes and they start to fund it and they start to really, in a massive way around the country, start to infuse programs into communities, I think that when people start to realize that our young people are very positive, that the vast, vast majority of them are doing just fine, especially when we engage them, I think that hopefully then we'll have a climate where people's fears and their anxieties will subside enough to where we start making sense. Then we'll start working on the rest of the issues that we've created for ourselves. But I think this is a great first step.
Thank you, Councilor.
Anything else?
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Also, I'd like to point out that when we were in the hearing, on the Youth Promise Act, it was incredibly helpful and a big boost for the Youth Promise Act when the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Congressman Conyers, showed up and spoke in support of it. That's the kind of leadership, that's the kind of support that is coming around for the Youth Promise Act. And it's going to take that kind of leadership and support to get the unanimous support on this legislation. True juvenile justice legislation can get unanimous support. When the Schiff Cardenas Act was vetoed the first time by Governor Gray Davis, and I put it on Governor Gray Davis's desk for the second time, when it got out of the State Assembly for the last time, it got a 78-0 vote. So it is possible for Republicans, Democrats, Independents, to every single one of them, to the person, to get enlightened to the point where they realize that this is good for the community. This is good legislation. So with that, we will go to public comment. We have, oh, that was you, huh? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's, okay. All right. Is there anybody else who'd like to make public comment on item number 1? This committee is now on item number 1, where public comment is now open. Okay. Okay, nobody else for comment on item number 1. With that, we will note and file the item.
Move on.
What's that?
Mr. Chair, this is a discussion item, so
Okay.
you just move on.
Okay,
Just-
we'll move on to item number 2. Thank you.
Item number 2 is motion Cardenas Weiss relative to departments to report on measures that can be taken to increase public awareness and access to the gang injunction removal process. This item was also referred to Public Safety Committee.
Okay. All right, City Attorney, who's here to represent the clerk's office?
I'll launch right into it, sir. Just introduce myself, Bruce Reardon, from the City Attorney's Office, the Director of Anti-Gang Operations. On my right, Arturo Martinez, on my left, Ann Tremblay, who are Deputy Chiefs of the Gang Division of the City Attorney's Office, former neighborhood prosecutors as well, who you know, but for the record, that's who they are, and they've all worked with me to provide you and your staff and this committee updates on what's going on with regard to, and we summarize it just for our records, which sometimes it's a little hard to follow, but we summarize it as responses. Really, we're sort of looking at this today as a response to motion 090558, but also 080150, and frankly, I think that's S2 that follows that, and then 06-0727. Again, I can't read the handwriting, but I apologize. The 3 motions, I have the motions here.
Well, while you're looking for that, I just wanted to thank all of you for all the wonderful work you've been doing. This is precedent-setting work, and I truly do believe that this is the work that's going to give impetus for other jurisdictions to do the same thing, and also go beyond the having a removal process for people who are on injunctions, but also removal processes for many, many individuals in many categories based on all the systems that we have throughout the country. This is something, once again, that's precedent-setting. It's the first time that I'm aware of, and I do scour the country to see who's doing what on these issues, and this seems to be the first time and the first of its kind. So thank you for doing the work. I know how hard it is to set precedent and how careful you have to be to get it right, and so far it appears that it's getting done very, very well. And once again, as always, please let the City Attorney, Rocky Delgadillo, know how much I appreciate all the energy and effort and the resources he's put into this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We appreciate those comments, and I will pass them on to the City Attorney. And you absolutely are correct that this is an effort that is at his direction, even though it may be individuals like us who show up. It's at his direction. And I'm glad that you've noticed that, because I know that how attentive you are to these issues. I know it's a priority and a passion for you, and it's your focus. I've seen the same thing, that a year ago I hoped that we would have traction in other jurisdictions. Now, for a variety of reasons, and hopefully just because it's a good idea, we're seeing traction. Other jurisdictions, certain jurisdictions like San Francisco reached out to us immediately. Some jurisdictions, slower. But I think that statewide, any area of the state that is, any jurisdiction in the state that has gang injunctions is at a minimum going to take a close look at doing something like this. And as you said, if what they see is a success, meaning that we have accomplished something and done so in a way that, while maybe at times controversial, was ultimately successful and didn't have the sort of problems that people thought it might have, that is a big selling point. And then to launch into that, if I may take 1 second, I want to thank you also for your focus on the Youth Promise Act. And you were so enthusiastic about it, sir. I got to tell you that I need to know more about it. I mean, you really got me energized about it. I think I follow these things pretty closely, but I don't think I followed that closely enough. I was at your council meeting a month or two ago, but that does sound like an exciting step forward for what we're all trying to do together. And then if I may, very briefly.
But once again, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the community again for bringing this to our attention, and also my colleague Janice Hahn, who also certainly brought the issue up as well. And we moved it to the form of a motion. We moved it to the discussions that I had with City Attorney Rocky Delgadillo. And as a result of that, through many hours of work through your office, we've come to where we are today. And again, I just want to thank the community for bringing this to our attention and believing in the legislative body and also the city attorney's office that we would listen and that we would actually follow through on our commitment, that if it can be done, the will is here to get it done, and here we are. So thank you very much.
And I will pass that back to the city attorney. And if I think then, to be responsive, I may have to be dry for a few seconds with, but I want to put on the record, and I know you want, as part of this record, because this committee and the entire group of people that work on it, and I notice so many of them here. It's a small group today, but these are the people who themselves or their organizations have been pushing this forward. Kim, I see Curtis Woodall, the Human Relations Committee. I don't want to leave anyone out, but it does take an entire city to make this thing happen. Where we are at right now, and the best description I can give you is this. This is the beginning, I think, of a new phase, and the new phase is going to be characterized of the removal petition, or the removal process. It's going to be characterized by two approaches from us, and working with you and the whole committee, and Councilmember Hahn, and everyone involved in this, in the community. A blanket approach, for my own purposes, and the best way I can describe it, is on one hand, a blanket approach, which is characterized by, and I'll share this with your staff later or tomorrow so that you can have a copy of it and then follow through on it. I've mentioned this to your staff before. I'm just starting to send out literally letters, 50 already, there'll be 50 more, letters to all of WorkSource organizations, to all the community organizations in prevention and intervention, whether it's Better LA or whether it's Mr. Rodriguez in the Valley, Janet Lockhart and Gloria Lockhart at Toberman House, the whole, Father Boyle, the whole list, just Bill Martinez, the whole list of people with a letter, with our package, here's the petition, here's contact numbers, just to make it easier and to keep it. The blanket approach is to some degree, maybe you could call it the shotgun approach, whatever expression people want to use. It does work. It just, you've got to get the message out and keep pounding away, because as was mentioned here today, Homeboy Industries, one of the most successful, if not the most successful organization of its type, they have budget problems. I would imagine that's a big concern to Father Boyle and his staff. So therefore, we need to keep knocking on that door to keep their attention when we know how busy they are. That's the blanket approach. Then we have, and this has really been a process, sir. In the last few months, we've come around to the need also, and I know you'll track with this and have already thought of it, the individualized approach, just an atomized, organization by organization. Kim, for example, from Youth Justice, has worked with people to submit applications. And then we will, in turn, work with her to refine those applications, to work that process out, if necessary, on an application-by-application basis. And this is what we've learned. But I know we've talked about this privately, so I know you're well aware of this phenomenon. But now we're getting and spreading it through LAPD as well. Let's say we get an application that, and we will, we already have a couple that, for better or worse, we're calling wobblers. They're wobbling, they're on the one foot, hard to make the judgment. LAPD may be uncomfortable with approving the person, but what we can do is say, come back in 6 months, come back in a year. So let's start with 6 months. LAPD, we meet with the chiefs, and I've met with each bureau chief and the command staff downtown. LAPD agrees with all of us. Oh, that's a pretty good, if you come back in 6 months and there's been no change or nothing but positive things to your record, that's probably, you're not gonna be a wobbler anymore. There's an application that's probably gonna be approved. Maybe it takes 9 months or a year, whatever the time is. Maybe it's 3 months.
So one thing that I want to make clear for the record is sometimes when there's some kind of application process or what have you,
Correct.
there's a limit. You can only try it once every 3 years or what have you. There's no inherent limit here.
No.
So basically, if somebody applies in January of 2009 and it turns out that maybe they need to get their act together a little bit better or what have you, like you mentioned in your example, could be 3 months later, 9 months later, a year later, they could submit again, and it would be a totally different day for them, once again, if in fact they haven't, in fact, been leading a very positive life.
Exactly, and that, you read it loud and clear, and we're fine. That's the individualized approach. That, we'll drill down to the individual application with, I use Kim as an example because she's here and because her focus is so intense on this subject, and therefore, and she's actually gone out and worked with people to get the applications in, which is why I want to, celebrate that. Even if some of those applications this is the expression we're using now, don't qualify. I think that word is less loaded. I couldn't agree with you more that words have power, and when they're loaded, they can have negative or positive power. Qualification, someone doesn't qualify. The reasons will be explained to them as best they can. If it's some reason that LAPD, for instance, if it's a confidential law enforcement reason, we'll deal with that. But in most cases, a person can be generally told, here's why you didn't qualify. Fix that, clean it up, come back in 6 months. I'm not saying that'll be easy, but that starts the process of creating that positive paper trail that we've talked about. So that's the individualized approach, the atomized, or just the approach of going organization by organization. And as to something else that we've been talking about that I know will be something I suspect will be something you'll want to participate in with us. It's coming back out to the Valley, for example, San Fernando Valley, where your council district is, and it'll take us a few months to put this together, but we'll do it. Meeting with, for example, the bar associations, could be the Mexican American Bar Association. They've indicated they want to talk about this, and providing a presentation to them, lawyer by lawyer if necessary. We'll invite every criminal defense lawyer.
How are you working with the mayor's office? They now have harnessed many of the gang intervention, prevention responsibilities through the mayor's office rather than most departments. So how are you working with them?
We are, again, I think also taking the lead of this committee, setting up a regular, I'll call it a monthly meeting with Jeff Carr and his team, although it's not set in stone as a monthly meeting, but attempting a monthly meeting with them, and it's basically been monthly, where we talk about this subject, and then leading to on June 2nd, and we'll also provide the information to your staff as well if they want to attend, although they've had the training on this subject, a training for all of the grid personnel put on the injunctions, but also on the petition. Mr. Martinez has put together a PowerPoint on page by page of the injunction petition, of the removal petition that, it can be, it's really, it's not a big picture, it's literally line by line if necessary to explain it to people. And we'll have that grid training on June 2nd, so just around the corner. And then from there,
And one of the things, Bruce, I think you're touching on is in our preliminary conversations about what this process should be like, even though it's being drawn up by lawyers, no offense, can get kind of wordy, many pages or what have you. One of the things that we talked about early on is being mindful of keeping it simplistic in the sense of being able to understand what the application is about. And that's something that continues to be the case, correct?
Absolutely, sir. We did talk about that from day one. Now, going back a couple of years, which is a little hard to...
So people don't have to hire a lawyer or an accountant or something like that to keep track of how to fill it out or...
To the point, we are tracking with you to such a degree that although I was the person who sent this particular email literally yesterday, Arturo or Ann could have sent the same. We were talking about some language we want to get to people's attention. For instance, an individual applicant, we want them to know that we want you to put names down of sources, corroboration, people who are your mentors, etc. But be aware that any source you put down, any name you put down, we may contact to check on it. It'll be confidential, but we may contact. And we just sent each other the email last night. We just got to make sure we keep that language simple. I say that over. Keep it simple. It shouldn't look like an employment form, which I can't even understand, although that doesn't say much. I think people smarter than me can understand, but I don't know if I'm the best example. But keep it simple. It's got to be something that you can say to someone who who's not a lawyer, but even if they are, gets it. You can understand, okay, I get it. You may contact anyone on my list. Yes, and you can take someone off your list if you don't want us to contact them. Whatever you want, but just be aware that we will check your sources.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do so in a professional, confidential, and polite manner. We're not an inquisition. But it's just, you should warn your people that they'll get a phone call from a city attorney.
So how are you doing with outreach to other city departments, et cetera? Have you been able to solidify any particular stream of communication with other departments besides, for example, the mayor's office, as you mentioned?
Yes, and I'll run through the list as quickly as possible, but we can always follow up with your staff in great detail. LAPD, we've had meeting after meeting on this and making fantastic progress. I mean, I think it's really, to be fair, I want to make sure I make it real clear. In a lot of ways, many of their command staff were ahead, at least of me, on this process. And they may not have had the language of this removal petition in mind, but they had the concept. So now it's been the process, and I'm sure Mr. Woodall could have testified to this, of getting the big machine that is LAPD to make it part of their protocol. And we are, I think, on the verge of having what do we call them, directives that I have to follow.
An operational order as well as a detective bureau order that relate to injunctions and the petition, so that it will be institutionalized within LAPD. All officers will need to comply with those directives as to how the injunction gets served and what the policies and procedures are with regard to the removal petition.
Well, congratulations.
We're working
Very good.
very closely with them, and they've been very supportive and helpful to make that happen over the last many months, and it's been
Excellent.
great.
They have.
We've made great progress, so we hope to be able to show you that soon.
Soon.
Who at the county level is now apprised of this process?
And at the county level,
Courts, probation,
And by the way, with the city, we're also working with City 311, which you've asked us to
Yes,
do, making progress with that, with the LA Police Commission, neighborhood councils, and various other city sources, community-based organizations, as well as the full city attorney's office, which is a large group. And if we can get all those prosecutors out there working in one direction, that's great. On the county level, I think we have to put that under the next phase. I have, with my colleagues, gone to the another acronym that I'm going to get tied up on, the CCJCC, which is the Countywide Justice Committee that meets approximately once a month up the hill in the county building. And also we're getting a lot of acronyms here, the IGTF, which Interagency Gang Task Force. LA City is a alphabet city, but the county is, as you well know, an alphabet county. But we are making presentations on this to the various gang-related organizations. And sir, you're absolutely right. I mean, at the time of these presentations...
What's your gut tell you about how they're receiving it?
My gut...
I'm hoping they're a little bit surprised that you've done it.
Yes.
But welcoming it.
Correct. My gut tells me that, for better or worse, we timed it right to bring it to their attention in 2009 when it was underway. Because I think that they get presentations on a monthly basis about pilot programs, projects that are in the air. This presentation was, this is real, it's happening, and you need to know about it. And what I sense is I sense that they are watching it with interest. And I think beginning to consider, watching the county come around to this will be an interesting experience, but considering a similar process for the county. That said, the city has, in this instance, moved much faster.
Well, good, good. I'm glad to hear that. But nothing by your experience tells you that there's any negative
Just took the time
receiving
I
of
wanted to be
this,
real clear
right?
on that. No,
Okay.
0.
Good.
I was surprised by that.
Yeah, because it is new. It is new, and you never know. They might look at us like we're crazy. They might look at us like, what you're doing doesn't make sense or what have you. But you're not getting any of that feedback. It is being received positively.
Yes.
Okay, good, good. Glad to hear that. Now, when it comes to the back to the city family of departments and agencies and all that, and some are probably more relevant than others when it comes to their being apprised of this process and perhaps being an access point where people can get this information. How's it coming along with the city?
Again, I think the city is very positive, and you're right, it's a big city, and it is a big city bureaucracy. The next step, immediate step, is grid on June 2nd. Then, and we anticipate that to be very successful because they have a real appetite for this information, and they're in place now. Build off of grid to take and meet with all of their contractors and
Intervention, prevention
all the
contractors.
next step, and do that this summer, and just keep launching forward. Other citywide groups.
Well, one thing I think is important, one of the things that Mr. Martinez has worked on is making sure that within the 311 system that when the 311 operators get a call if something's said about injunction or petition, that they can enter those search terms into their constituent
Excellent.
service directory and get that, because I think it was when one of the CLA analysts pointed out that
Right.
in an attempt to call 311, that they weren't able to respond to the request because they didn't have that information. So Mr. Martinez has been working diligently to make sure that we follow the procedures to get that information into the system. So, but I actually got myself a call from a 311 operator who got just gangs and figured city attorney's office, and so I was able to provide the information
good.
to that individual operator. So she was well trained enough to contact us directly.
That's a
so.
really important point, and I apologize for interrupting, but I also want to emphasize that worked so well because of the diligence of Mr. Martinez, Ms. Tremblay, your staff, but also the CLA. They really diligently ran this down with us. I talked to and met with the CLA. I wasn't the only one. That was a good example of the messages getting out across the city hall. I mean, the CLA also participated in, you gave them a directive to see how this would work, and they really worked on it. And we think that the 311 system now will work to direct people. Of course, we also have phone numbers and websites. And we're going to have to spend this next phase of the summer, particularly after the grid meeting on June 2nd, with just getting the message out to, I think for example, the step will be to keep reminding ourselves to get out of City Hall and into the valley, into the west, into south, into San Pedro, into the east, because some people, a lot of people and a lot of people who are very important to prevention and intervention efforts are not in City Hall, and most of them aren't. And we need to get to them. Move the mountain to Muhammad, if that expression fits.
Okay, good, good. Well, there's a mountain of work to be done on this when it comes to communicating with the public. Now, my last question is, how's it coming along with the number of applications that are still in play at this time? They're still being reviewed. A rough idea of how many applications, and then also how many people have actually made it to being removed?
I can give you the exact breakdown, thankfully, to Mr. Martinez and Ms. Tremblay. Total petitions are 32.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we're starting to get real numbers, and we want to double that, of course, but we have 32, and I hope after this next push that we see 32 more. I anticipate we will. Average age right now, and this may surprise, certainly surprise me, average age is 30 years old. Here are the LAPD Bureau breakdowns: 7 for Central, 20 for South Bureau, and I suspect that's because of the efforts of the Watts Gang Task Force, Kim, and the Youth Justice, and others. 5 for the Valley and 0 for the West Bureau, which doesn't surprise me, the 0 for the West Bureau. That's where our smallest amount of anti-gang resources are too. And that said, the 5 for the Valley, I anticipate with the push that we've been talking about with your staff, that'll, we think, be a citywide push involving yourself, this committee, it'll probably be the next city attorney, as the case may be, because time is running out on this term. The LAPD, we've talked to them about it. Chief Moore, getting out and doing a sort of a town hall type effort in the valley, and I would anticipate numbers will go up in the valley. I'd like to see that 5 get up to 20. I know you'd feel the same way. Status summary: approved 1, still remains at 1, withdrawn 1, pending 14. We're still finishing off the investigation, and now we have a coordinator who is she's a part-time person within the office, but full-time on this. And she wasn't selected because she was part-time. She was selected because of her qualities. And frankly, that expression part-time doesn't begin to define her.
So the bottom line is, as the applications grow, this person does have capacity
Correct.
to handle more applications.
Correct.
Okay, so we're not capping out on capacity of evaluating applications.
We are definitely not capped out.
Good.
And we don't, if it comes to this person being fully utilized at all times, we will support them through the gang division, and then we'll find more help within the office. Not approved is 9 at this point. 1 turned out to have been verified in the answer to the gang injunction. Was someone who was just literally had come into court and verified as a member of a gang in a gang injunction, so has a pending action that's going forward. 4 recent contact evidenced gang activity. 4 were recent convictions of gang activity while it was pending, which it's going to happen. Not applicable. This is a group where we still actually encourage. Here's what we've learned, which I know will make all this stuff we've talked about before, but here's what we're learning as part of the process. Some people had contacts with LAPD, because that's our relevant agency, that's why I refer to them, had a contact with LAPD in a safety zone at some point. They are concerned that maybe what's known as an FI or a field investigation note was written up. They're concerned that maybe they are on a list of a gang injunction. They're concerned that they might be on Cal gangs. So the Cal gangs I can't help them with. But we do encourage people to apply. We'll get the answer for you. 6 were not applicable. There was no record of service, or in 2, there was no gang injunction in place at the time. And 1 person we've asked for resubmission.
Well, even with those, it's a sigh of relief for them to realize that they're wondering if they're on the list, and then when they go through this process, they're finding out that they're not.
Correct.
So that must be a tremendous relief for them.
I'm glad you
So
say
it serves
that.
another purpose.
Correct. We in the last few weeks we've begun to realize, and I certainly am fully convinced of this, as I now am more convinced hearing you say it, that this category is the category that actually is a success, in the sense that 6 individuals have been informed that they are not subject to the enforcement of a gang injunction in the city of LA. They didn't have to qualify through the process. That's just part of the education that as a city we should be doing. And we never were doing before, but now we are. And that list, so I think some people, and the talking around, we need to get that message out, that people shouldn't be, if they think they might be subject to a gang injunction, enforcement in the city of LA, one way to find out is to fill out this petition. They will get an answer.
Mm-hmm. And just a cynical question. When they realize that they're not, it's not like they're going to be put on a list. No. It's like, oh, thank you for letting us know we missed you. Now, my point is,
Yeah, that's a great
again,
question,
this is all confidential.
Correct.
If once they submit it, it's not used against them. It's nothing bad about it. It's purely positive.
Correct.
This is to clarify and actually to see if the person's, in fact they're on the list, then it goes through the process. And like those 6 individuals, you realize they're not on the list. You notify them that they're not on the list. It doesn't hurt them in any way.
Right. That's a good point. That is a very good point to get.
And the reason why I say that, because if a person actually has some kind of inkling or feeling that they may be on the list, they probably, with all due respect, might be a little nervous to be around law enforcement. They might be a little nervous about contacting the city attorney's office or what have you. Not that they have anything to hide. They just don't feel comfortable, perhaps, for whatever rumors in the community or what have you. So the fact that 6 people that thought they may have been on the list have actually applied and are now relieved to know that they're not on the list, that's a positive thing. And to me, hopefully they'll go back to the community and encourage other people to fill out the form and, maybe simply to find out if they're on the list or not.
Well, this back and forth is very helpful to us, because I know that we are constantly trying to refine this, and I suspect that we will now, starting tomorrow, refine our presentations to the public to emphasize this point as well. Because you're right, this is the part that you mentioned, don't take offense at calling us lawyers. I don't. And not only are we lawyers, we're prosecutors. We are. I mean, that is my career. And I have to always remember and try to remember every day that I, quote unquote, think like a prosecutor, which means I don't think like a person in the community. And what's so-called obvious to me, of course we're not going to use this against you. That's not obvious.
Not obvious to them. Yeah. Okay. Well, anything else you'd like to add? Those are the list of questions that I have for you today.
No, sir. We have two things. I apologize. I'll be very brief. I know it's a long day and a hot day. One, our guidelines are being revised. Our city attorney guidelines, which are in writing, and we have worked closely with you over the last 2 years in creating the original version, which also never existed anywhere, not just in the city, but anywhere else. We are revising, and the revision should be done, and we've revised it. We'll provide a copy to your staff confidentially. Publicly, it should be produced within a week or two. It'll go online. We'll get it out. And in the new guidelines, we're incorporating all of the petition process and the removal petition. When we wrote the original guidelines 2 years ago, it was just a new policy that we would create a removal process. So we're going to incorporate now the creative process. And then as a last note, if I may, I'd really appreciate, again, your focus on the youth. Here's something that comes up a lot in our office, sir, which I think hope is of value to you. Our prosecutors work with us. We have a pretty progressive, I think, group of prosecutors now who are very capable at their job and aggressive when necessary, but have an open mind when needed as well. That said, we only have adult jurisdiction. The city attorney's office, we don't have juvenile jurisdiction. So I learn a lot when I come here, trust me. One thing we hear a lot from our prosecutors is an expression, even when files reach them, of a 20-year-old or a 22-year-old, which is a young person. Oftentimes that person may be, and I use this expression just not to characterize, but only to emphasize the dramatic importance of reaching people when they're young, when they're juveniles. That person, to some degree, may be lost. Now, anyone can be redeemed, and it's not for me to judge. I'm just saying that the more I do this, the more I learn that your emphasis and the people who preceded us, their emphasis on reaching the potential pool of gang members or whatever else you want to call them, it's critical that it be done before age 18.
And that's why eventually we're going to hopefully have a process with the DA's office.
Correct. We need that.
It's up to the DA. It's another jurisdiction. But again, this is an example that is precedent setting, but also I hope it turns out to prove to be as priceless as we know it is. Something that you can't put a value on it, but it will in fact be the impetus for many other jurisdictions, and hopefully we'll see the first DA jurisdiction actually take it up and work on a process that applies to juveniles. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, staff, and the CLA as well. For all that
Any-
work in the last couple of months.
Thank you. Any progress from or updates from the city clerks?
City clerk is here.
Okay, good.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. My name is Conrad Carter, the Office of City Clerk.
You're by yourself? You decided to be shy today, or what?
Just tired.
We'll make this brief.
We started at the county at 5:30 this morning for the
Ooh, wow.
Holly Walcott, Executive Officer, Office of the City Clerk.
Okay.
But I'm going to let Conrad talk.
Looking at the motion asks that the city clerk include web links to gang injunction removal petition on committee and council agendas. We have done some research and determined that is technically possible.
Good.
We've checked with the city attorney, and the city attorney has appraised us that it's a policy issue, and we can do that, and we will, as soon as council instructs that this is the action, we will be happy to
Cool.
go ahead with it.
Excellent. Excuse me. Excellent. Okay. So when it comes to the committees or what have you, once we can do that, it's technically possible to link all what we determine as relevant committees,
Yes.
to link them? Okay. Wonderful. Including the Public Safety Committee, that's for sure. All right. Okay, wonderful. So it's technically possible. So you have that answer, so all you need is instruction. All right. Anything else?
No, that's it.
Good. It's good news. Okay. All right. You won't be here till 5:30. It's only 5 o'clock. So you'll be shy of a 12-hour day. Okay. Anybody else to make comment on item number 2? Public comment is now open on item number 2. Seeing and hearing no one come forward for public comment on item number 2, public comment on item number 2 is now closed. With that, this committee, it'll be recommendation of the chair that this item be adopted by this committee and forwarded. Okay, thank you. Is there anybody here for general public comment? General public comment? General public comment is open in this committee. Seeing no one come forward for general public comment, general public comment is now closed. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, adjourn the meeting.
Oh, and this meeting is now adjourned.
Well, I'm gonna go, keep myself busy at a forum that Chief Bratton's putting on, sir, and then I'll find out who my new boss is tomorrow.
Okay, yeah, I know. All right.
Thank you.
Watch them
Thanks for your time.
returns.
I will stay in touch with you through your staff.
You bet.
As